Come to order. Today's hearing will focus on recent developments in the continuing effort on the part of the United States government to determine the fate of those Americans who are still missing in action in Indochina. But before I deliver an opening statement setting forth the context in which this hearing will be conducted, I do want, for the benefit of my colleagues on the subcommittee who are here, to say a few words about the investigation that our subcommittee had been conducting into the question of the hidden wealth of the Marcoses in the Philippines. As most of the members undoubtedly know, when the Marcoses left Manila and came to Hawaii, it turned out that they had brought substantial properties, assets, documents, and other items with them. And it appeared that some of the information that they had with them might bear directly on the investigation which we had been conducting over the course of the last several months. In the last 2 days, I have been, together with our very distinguished ranking minority member, Mr. Leach, in constant communication with representatives of the administration in an effort to secure access to the documents and other information which the Marcoses and their associates brought with them to the United States that may have some bearing on our investigation into their hidden wealth in the United States. And I'm very pleased to say at this time that we have been assured by a senior official of the administration that all of the relevant documentation will be made available to the subcommittee in a timely fashion. I expect that we'll receive the documentation probably in the next few days or at the beginning of next week at the latest, at which time we will commence a systematic review of those papers. I cannot at this point say whether any of the information we will be given will in fact confirm some of the testimony we've already received, or whether it will indicate the existence of other assets controlled by the Marcoses, although I am informed by various sources that some of the material that will be turned over clearly does bear on these matters. It comes to 1,500 documents that we will be given, and it will take some time to go through it, but I hope we can complete that task in an expeditious fashion. Furthermore, Senator Salonga, who was appointed by President Aquino to chair the Commission on Good Government in the Philippines, which has been given the responsibility for identifying and recovering the hidden wealth of the Marcoses and their associates in the United States, to the extent it can be established that they were the result of unjust enrichment resulting from official misconduct, will be here next week, and I hope that arrangements can be made for him to meet with the subcommittee in order for him to be able to share with us what information they have been able to obtain. For the moment, suffice it to say that based on my discussions with him last week in Manila and some of the documentation he showed me that they've already uncovered, it is quite clear that evidence is available which unmistakably and by name links President Marcos to holdings in this country and to the Bernstein brothers, who seem to have represented him in the management of his real estate portfolio, at least in New York. At some point later in the hearing, when we have a quorum of the subcommittee, I will be making a motion to release some of the or most of the testimony which the subcommittee received in closed session at the outset of our investigation, on the grounds that there is no longer any need to keep it secret, but we'll take that up later in the hearing. I'd like now to move to today's subject, which is to review the recent efforts made by the executive as well as the legislative branch of the government to account for Americans still missing in Southeast Asia. I wish I could say honestly that I am pleased to chair today's meeting and that I look forward to hearing from our distinguished guests. However, I do not relish convening today's hearing because, in my view, the issue of Americans missing in action ought to have been resolved years ago. This remaining legacy of our involvement in Indochina, this lingering, festering wound, should have healed long ago. However, it has not. The reason it is not is because until recently, the governments of Vietnam and Laos have been unwilling to cooperate with us in our effort to account for our missing men. Families of our missing continue to suffer the wounds of war as reports of live Americans in Vietnam and Laos continue to surface. So long as there is the slightest possibility that Americans may be alive and held against their will in Vietnam and Laos, we have a moral responsibility to the families and to the nation to pursue this issue at the highest levels until we are satisfied that it can be pushed no further. We cannot and we will not close the book on the Vietnam War until the final chapter has been written, until we receive a full and complete accounting of our missing. This subcommittee's primary focus continues to be on negotiations between the United States, Vietnam, and Laos, and on how the administration, together with the Congress and the families, can convince Vietnam and Laos that cooperating with us is essential and in their best interest. When it comes to POW MIAs, there is no difference of opinion between the Congress and the administration, or between Democrats and Republicans. This is not a partisan issue, or one to be used for political gains. This is an American issue that we must solve together. Thus, when U.S. officials meet with representatives of Vietnam and Laos, they speak not only for the President, but also for Congress, for families, for veterans organizations, and the public. Their message is the message of all Americans, and it is this: the United States is committed to accounting for its missing and considers such accountability the highest national priority. We cannot and we will not discuss future relations between our governments until this issue is resolved. I want at this point to pay very special tribute to some of the members of this committee who have worked extraordinarily hard and effectively in connection with this matter. I refer particularly to my very good friend from New York, Congressman Gerald Solomon, who for the last year has chaired the task force on POW and MIAs, and who has worked tirelessly on behalf of this issue. I think he deserves the thanks not only of the families and of his colleagues in the Congress, but of the American people for his prodigious efforts to focus attention on this problem and to seek a solution for it. I also think a good deal of appreciation is due to my other good friend from New York, Mr. Gilman, who was a prior chairman of the task force on POWs and MIAs and who continues to maintain an active and extraordinarily constructive role in this effort. And to my good friend, Congressman Dornan, another previous chairman of the task force, who has remained active on this issue as well. I hope none of my colleagues whose names I haven't mentioned who remain active and who are active will in any way think that their efforts are either unnoticed or unappreciated. But if I referred to everybody, our time would run out before the hearing is over. A great deal has happened since our last hearing in June in terms of our government-to-government negotiations. Vietnam has repatriated the remains of 26 Americans in August, the largest turnover since 1975. At the September technical meeting, Hanoi agreed to conduct a joint excavation, which was completed in November. In December, Vietnam repatriated an additional 7 remains, 5 of which were identified and announced yesterday. In January, the highest ever ranking U.S. delegation, headed by Assistant Secretary of Defense Armitage, met with Vietnamese officials in Hanoi. And the Vietnamese told the delegation, headed by Congressman Jerry Solomon, that there, quote, may be Americans alive in Vietnam, close quote, and agreed to discuss allowing U.S. personnel to accompany search teams investigating reports of Americans. We have also witnessed encouraging signs in our developments with the Lao. In recognition of Laos's sustained cooperation, the administration requested and Congress agreed to remove Laos from the prohibition of aid list. In September, a Lao delegation visited the Central Identification Lab in Hawaii and met with U.S. officials. Just 2 weeks ago, U.S. and Lao personnel successfully completed the excavation of an AC-130 air crash near Savan Ket and surveyed another crash site that could be excavated as early as this dry season. While both governments deny they are holding Americans, we certainly welcome these developments and consider them encouraging. However, we also urge Vietnam and Laos to accelerate their commitment to resolving this issue on a humanitarian basis and to expedite their timetable. Today, we have a full lineup to discuss a variety of perceptions of the recent effort to account for Americans missing in action. First, Congressman Bill Hendon, who will briefly explain the need for legislation he has introduced that would establish a presidential commission on POWs and MIAs. Next, we have a panel of distinguished congressmen who recently went to Vietnam and Laos to discuss POWs and MIAs. They are Congressman Gerald Solomon, Ben Gilman, Bob Dornan, Mike Bilirakis, and Bob McCune. We then will hear from Richard Armitage, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, General Perutz, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and John Manjo, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And finally, last but certainly not least, Ann Mills Griffiths, the Executive Director of the National League of Families, will brief us on how the families view these recent developments. I just told Ann that there is one other woman who has almost eclipsed her in my esteem and admiration, and that's Cory Aquino, but Ann still remains number one. Because I have promised to excuse the administration at 4 p.m., I must ask all witnesses to please submit their testimony for the record and to summarize their remarks, if possible, in 5 minutes. I apologize for this Spartan rule, but I do want to leave the maximum time for questions. For our part, we will operate up here, as we have not always in the past, with the 5-minute rule, so that we can conclude today's meeting before midnight. Before I ask Congressman Hendon to begin his testimony, if any of my colleagues would like to make some opening remarks, they're welcome to do so.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leach.
Just to be very brief, I would like to reflect a total sharing of everything you've said, plus an observation that this is the only subcommittee that I know of that a Democratic chairman is named Republican task force chairman. And that, I think, underscores the spirit of which the subcommittee operates. And the minority particularly wants to express its appreciation to the chairman of this subcommittee for that designating of Republican chairman of the task force. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman very much for his remarks. If there are no further observations.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if I might just take a moment, I wanted to thank you for arranging this timely hearing, and I note that another former chairman of this task force and a chairman of this committee, former Congressman Wolf, is in attendance with a sustained interest in this issue. And I also see that George Brooks, our president of the National League of Families of Missing in Action, is also with us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate your pointing out their presence, particularly Congressman Wolf, whom I saw a few days ago in Tokyo en route back from Manila. He served for several years with great distinction as chairman of the subcommittee, and he left his footprints all over Asia. Whenever I travel in the region, I'm always reminded of his many good works on behalf of America. Congressman Hendon, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll assure you I will abide by the 10-minute rule, and I apologize that I couldn't get my testimony to the committee before now. But as you know, I was only invited to testify some 48 hours ago. Mr. Chairman, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to convey to the committee my feelings on why we need an independent commission to investigate the tragedy of our POWs still held in communist prisons in Southeast Asia. We need this commission, Mr. Chairman, for the same reason that we needed an independent commission to investigate the space shuttle tragedy. NASA is renowned for its excellence and its fine, dedicated, patriotic employees. But who here, Mr. Chairman, believes that NASA, in an internal investigation, would have ruled itself flawed? Agencies, however fine, however dedicated, don't often do that, Mr. Chairman. But independent commissions, where the facts call for it, do make such findings, if warranted. Look at for a moment at what we have learned from the Rogers Commission. I believe it's relevant as it relates to the need for this commission. December 17, 1982, NASA memo warns gases might burn through O-rings, destroying mission, vehicle, and crew. NASA, 3 months later, strikes requirement for foolproof backup seal. July 17, internal NASA report reveals 12 instances of seal erosion on launch. NASA orders more studies. July 23rd, NASA budget analyst warns that seals might threaten flight safety. Officials deemed report overstated. July 31, memo by top expert on O-ring seals warns of catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. NASA officials later say they never saw the memo. August 19, finally, Thiokol engineers briefed NASA on severe problems of the seal erosion. NASA concludes problems don't warrant suspension of flight. All this, Mr. Chairman, while the shuttle continued to fly. Fine, dedicated, patriotic people doing the best they could under the circumstances on all sides, but marching, apparently, to different drummers, under different pressures, honorable people with the same goals, but different ways of achieving them. Fine people, but flawed management. That's at least what I read so far from the Commission. Upon unbiased study and reflection, it is clear that there were numerous warnings, Mr. Chairman, along the way, but the bureaucracy, as it often does, failed for whatever reason to respond in time. If in fact they could have saved, they failed to respond in time to save those brave astronauts. Mr. Chairman, with the POW issue, it's a little different in that I firmly believe that all of us working together still can save our brave POWs. But I feel very strongly only if we examine this issue in great detail with the same dispassionate approach, and only if we respond to the repeated warnings that we too have received. In 1981, Mr. Chairman, you and I and several others here were at the testimony. General Tye, head of Defense Intelligence, testified that he was, quote, absolutely certain that U.S. POWs remained prisoner in Southeast Asia. That was 5 years ago. I would like to resubmit General Tye's testimony of that date for the record. In 1983, our committee was told of live Americans being seen by a credible source in Hanoi in 1979. The source was, I repeat, deemed credible. We have, of course, received a number of such credible reports. Later in July in 1983, the committee was again informed of POWs in Southeast Asian prisons. I submit that information again, Mr. Chairman, for the record. In 1984, our esteemed and respected colleague, Mr. Applegate of Ohio, told the committee that the U.S. government was tracking live POWs long after the war ended. He said in testimony, Mr. Chairman, I'm outraged to think that our government knew of these live Americans up to and past the end of the Vietnamese conflict, and yet knowingly left them in captivity and did nothing about it. While it may be old news, it clearly shows that we knew we left our boys over there. If we were tracking live Americans in '79, he said, I'm confident we're still tracking them now. In the spring of 1985, General Tye said the following, and many of my colleagues and friends have read this from the Wall Street Journal. Very troubling statements, Mr. Chairman. Quote, some people involved in the U.S. government effort have been disclaiming good reports for so long it's become habit forming. I continue, General Tye said, to run into civilians in the U.S. government associated with this issue who tend to think that military personnel are expendable. He calls for a presidential commission and then goes on to say, at least in one case, that DIA analysis shows a mindset to debunk, very troubling to all of us. In the summer of '85, this committee was again warned by now retired General Ty that our men remain prisoner, and in fact, General Ty indicated, if we recall, press testimony, ex-DIA chief says 50 to 60 Americans still held captive. Finally, Mr. Chairman, in December 1985, General Ty said more, and I would like to enter and call attention to my colleagues to this tape that I'd like to show. It's about 3 minutes. It will not run over my limit, and implore my colleagues to take heed of the statement of this fine and very respected general who is, or was, the former head of all U.S. military intelligence. If you'll bear with me, Mr. Chairman, it will just take 3.5 minutes and will fall under my guidelines. Go ahead, Barbara. Thank you.
Prisoners of war alive in Indochina? That's a question that haunts most of the families of the almost...
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, my subcommittee is taking up Graham Rudman on the international organizations, of which I am very much interested in. Being a delegate to the UN, I'd like to get down there, get my testimony on, and if we're going to accomplish what we're going to accomplish, we better stick to the 5-minute rule. I will testify and come back as quick as I possibly can, but it's terribly important. It's millions and millions of dollars to the taxpayers.
Your priorities are in order, Mr. Solomon. I know you'll be coming back, but if I can encourage you to try to bring this.
This will be it, Mr. Chairman, and I have one paragraph closing statement. Go ahead, Barbara, if you can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence. This is critically important, and I believe many members of the committee have not seen this. It's very powerful testimony.
Vietnam War. The Vietnamese, the Laotians, and the Cambodians say there are none. Not so the Reagan administration, which presumes American POWs are still alive and has made their return a top priority. But at the same time, the administration says it has no evidence of that. Now, 2 former prisoners of war, one a convicted collaborator who returned from Vietnam in 1979, and the other a highly decorated war hero, say there is overwhelming evidence that Americans are still being held captive in Indochina. And they are not alone in that view. The man who was in charge of gathering intelligence for the Department of Defense, retired General Eugene Tai, says there are American prisoners of war in Southeast Asia.
Given your experience, a career in military intelligence, is there any doubt in your mind that Americans are being held prisoner?
None at all.
General Tai was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1977 until his retirement in 1981.
Based on what?
Based on hundreds of live sighting reports, which we filtered and sifted out and cross-checked one against the other, interviewed the reporters themselves, polygraphed them where we had the chance, checked their bona fides from every direction that we could, and found reports that could not be refuted. And there are similar reports on the record today that the current people in DIA briefed the Congress on the 27th of June, for example. Unresolved, unexplainable reports that won't go away about live American sightings in Vietnam.
Mr. Chairman, now for 1 minute to close, General Tai's statement on what does it take to resolve this issue?
What would it take to bring about some kind of action? A photograph, names, fingerprints?
We would like to have a report which is current and specific regarding the circumstances of the captivity. We would, if we had our way, like a second refugee report or something of that nature, which basically stated the same set of facts under generally the same set of circumstances. Additionally, we would like to be able to, through one of our national technical means, verify the report.
Have you seen reports that match all of those qualifications?
Yes, I have.
You have said that there are at least 50 to 60
Chairman, I
POWs.
think that's significant, and I appreciate your tolerance. General Tai saying that he has seen reports that meet all qualifications. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I agree with that. And though 13 years have passed and the best efforts of all involved, there have been numerous warnings along the way, and I believe, and trust that we can still save these brave men, and I would look forward to full hearings on this bill, though I recognize that not everyone agrees with me or those 133 co-sponsors who have signed this bill. You mentioned a presidential commission. This bill calls for a congressional commission. I would welcome a presidential commission or any independent commission to help resolve this issue. And, Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for allowing me to enter these things in the
Thank you very much, Mr. Endon. Now that the DIA has announced that General Ty and H. Ross Perot will work for the agency on a consulting basis, do you think there's still a need for a congressional commission? And if so, why isn't their participation with DIA on a consultative capacity sufficient?
Mr. Chairman, I stated, I believe during my prepared remarks, the overwhelming and compelling need I see for an independent, outside the agency commission. Secretary Armitage, in the morning paper this morning, the Washington Times, referred to charges that have been made as ludicrous. And I think that's prejudging this whole thing, Mr. Chairman. I think we desperately need not to prejudge and simply to address these questions once and for all.
Your legislation calls for Mr. Perot to head the commission?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Now, I've been given to believe that Mr. Perot has stated that he would not head a commission of such a nature unless asked to do so by the President. It's also my impression that the President has no intention of asking Mr. Perot to head such a commission. If that's the case, what is the purpose of establishing a commission to be headed by someone who says he won't head the commission unless asked to do so by the President if the President has no intention of asking?
That's a very good question, Mr. Chairman. I've talked to Mr. Perot, obviously, repeatedly over the last months, last time about 45 minutes ago, just before this hearing. And I think that is a legitimate question. I believe it can be worked out. He has received, and I think it's common knowledge, a call recently from the Vice President asking him to participate in the internal investigation. And as I was telling Chairman Solomon just before this committee, he will get back in touch with the parties on that. I'm not sure whether he's going to do that or not, nor is he, Mr. Chairman.
If he is unwilling to head the commission, you still want a commission?
Oh, absolutely, sir. I think the need is compelling. And
regardless of whether he's prepared to lead it or not?
Well, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Now, supporters of your bill have attacked personally those members of Congress who, for reasons of foreign policy, have opposed your legislation. Some of whom may believe that since there have already been 2 commissions on this, that there's no longer a need for a third. Others of whom believe that this subcommittee and the task force have fully and responsibly discharged their oversight responsibilities and that there is therefore no need for an additional commission. But those who support your legislation have attacked these members and have charged them as a result of their opposition to your legislation with not caring about the fate of our POWs and MIAs. Is it your view that if a member of Congress does not support your bill, that he or she is unsympathetic to the cause of POWs and MIAs?
Let me use Rich Armitage's language. That's ludicrous, Mr. Chairman, and I think you and I and all members would agree on that. You've certainly not heard me say anything like that, sir, and you certainly never will. It's interesting, though, you mentioned other commissions, that one of the esteemed members of our body, G.V. Sonny Montgomery, the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, who was the chairman of the Montgomery Commission, which ruled our men dead. In a joint press release, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this in the record with me, has he and I have asked H. Ross Perot to consider heading a presidential commission to investigate this. So, you know, there's obviously room for disagreement here as to how we do it, but
well, over the course of the last several years, as you know, this subcommittee has conducted innumerable hearings on this issue. We have heard from many witnesses. We established a task force which has spent literally hundreds of hours listening to allegations, sifting through evidence. I would be interested in finding out what you think our subcommittee or the task force should have done or might have done that it hasn't done which would justify the need for the establishment of a commission. Because there is an implication here that somehow or other we haven't done our jobs adequately or effectively, and that a commission would be able to obtain information that we haven't been able to obtain. I mean, I ask this question, among other things, because if it should turn out that your legislation is not adopted, which is a possibility, you do have many co-sponsors, but a majority of the House has not co-sponsored it. That doesn't mean they're against it.
Of course.
But if it should turn out that your commission is not established, we're still left with the responsibility of dealing with this issue. And I certainly have attached a top priority to this, and I would very much like to know, particularly in the event your legislation is not adopted, what we should do that we haven't been doing, because if there are things we should do that we haven't been doing that would be helpful here, you can be sure we'll do them. I mean, the last thing I ever want anybody to ever say about me or my colleagues on this subcommittee is that we have neglected to fulfill our responsibilities or to pursue
Mr. Chairman,
every
that's certainly
possibility.
not implicit in any way in the forming of a new commission. I think what we're saying very clearly is we have had, I was sitting, I think, in this very room, perhaps Jerry Solomon, you were there, Ben, I think, was here, many of us were, in 1981, when the Director of Defense Intelligence came before us and said, I'm absolutely certain, Mr. Chairman, that they're there. It's now 1986. That's not to question your performance, mine, or anybody else, Mr. Chairman, but the men aren't home yet.
Right, but I take your point, Mr. And assuming the men are there, I mean, there are people who believe there are others who think they may be, and there are still others who believe they aren't. I don't know that the question has been definitively established. Certainly, if they are there, we need to do everything we can as a Congress and as a country to facilitate their release, their return. But my question is this. This subcommittee has the power to subpoena witnesses.
Yes, sir.
It has the power to take testimony. We've even on occasion been known to cite recalcitrant witnesses for contempt of Congress. They don't cooperate with us. Presumably this commission would have such powers also. It's not clear to me what the commission could do or would do that we either haven't done or couldn't do in the future. I mean, what would you expect the commission to do that we haven't done? That's what I'm trying to get
Mr. Chairman, the buzzers went off. They're going to go off again in a few minutes. We may have a vote. You know our schedules, Chairman, and all the members. We all know our schedules. We know how difficult it is to find time. We have, several of my colleagues and I have 2-hour briefings once a week from DIA, and I hope everybody's getting the invitation to come every week. It's very difficult to find the time, and we all understand that. And I think, having talked to Mr. Perot about this, I believe we need a group, just like the Rogers Commission, to spend full time, if it is a matter, and I am confident that you agree, and Chairman Solomon, all of us do, a matter of the highest national priority, then I think we ought to put full time on it, Mr. Chairman. I had 10 minutes today. I'm very grateful to get 10, but this is the first opportunity we've had to talk about a bill which I think is very important, 133 co-sponsors, and we've had 10 minutes. With the greatest respect to the committee, I wish somebody could be working this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I appreciate your comments. Of course, you know that there are many, many bills introduced in Congress, and hearings are only held on a few of them. And it is true, this is the first time you've been invited to testify on the bill, but as you know, your legislation has been the subject of discussion on the part of the subcommittee, and questions about it have been put to the administration in the past. It's not as if it's been languishing in what Woodrow Wilson in his book Congressional Government once characterized as those dim dungeons of silence, which are the congressional committees into which legislation is sent, from which it never emerges.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I certainly know of your interest and are very appreciative of it.
Mr. Leach.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions, but I would simply say that on issues of public life, sometimes it's good to have a gadfly, particularly a stick-to-itive one, and I don't know of any member of this Congress that's worked harder than you have, Bill, and that's on this issue, and I think that's very much appreciated, and I would hope if a commission ever does eventuate, that you be named to that commission. I think it would be a very helpful perspective, and I think that all of us are very much in your debt and the efforts you've made in this direction. So I want to thank you for your testimony, and I do think it fair to express as well appreciation that the chairman has brought out the possibility of a hearing. As you know, many times bills that are presented by members of the minority never do get a hearing in any committee of this particular House of Representatives, and so I do think the chairman should be thanked for this hearing.
Absolutely.
As well.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to just briefly interrupt the questioning and take advantage of the presence of a quorum of the subcommittee to move that the testimony that was taken in executive sessions of the Asian and Pacific Affairs Subcommittee in December 1985 from Mr. Ralph Bernstein, Mr. Joseph Bernstein, Mr. William Deo, Mr. Hofstetter, and Mr. Camacho be released to the public, and the staff be authorized to prepare certain extracts for release as soon as possible. Second, if there is no debate, without objection, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Okay. I don't believe a roll call is needed. Mr. Gadenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that I think all of us who are concerned about this issue worry about is that we don't play with the emotions of the families out there, that every time a congressional hearing occurs or calls for new investigations, that this raises the hopes of families who lost young men in Vietnam. And I think all of us are concerned that we don't raise these emotions and only to leave them hanging or to drop them off a cliff, that we have to be very careful in the hopes that we raise because of the damage this does to the families back home. Do you have new information? Do you have the kind of information that you feel comfortable raising this issue, obviously? And could you give us one example of that solid information that continues your efforts, that drives you forward?
To answer that question, perhaps, Sam, you missed what General Tai said. He said that he has seen convincing evidence, all of the criteria that the government has set forth as convincing evidence. He, as the former Director of Defense Intelligence, says he's seen it.
He is now going to be working as a consultant for the government, as I understand it. But do you have information that you can give us here that gives us some sense that there are people still being held prisoner?
I can defer to the chairman of the task force regarding our recent trip. I think we all came back very firm, believing firmly in that.
Thank you.
Mr. Torricelli. Do you have any questions, Bob?
Chairman, I can pass it this time.
Okay. My good friend from California, Mr. Daimler.
Mr. Chairman, I welcome you back. For a while there, I thought you wouldn't come back, so my chances of becoming chairman of this subcommittee may have increased in your absence, but I'm glad to have you back with us. Mr. Herndon.
Yes, sir.
I am very supportive of your resolution, but one question, is it necessary to tombstone this commission with the name of an individual, even though this individual has made tremendous contributions to this cause? Could we not have a congressional commission on American missing in Southeast Asia rather than to tombstone the commission with one person's name?
Mr. Dimely, I'm not trying at all to be cute, sir, but I've heard gadfly and now tombstone. Tombstone to you, sir, means what? To burden it or to enhance it? And I apologize.
It's stuck in there forever. You just engrave it in the tombstone.
I see, sir.
It's a California
yes, sir.
terminology.
I'm from North Carolina.
ask my friend Don, and he'll tell you.
I don't think we could do a better thing for our POWs or our country, Mr. Dimely, than to have Ross Perot head this commission. I believe that very strongly and very firmly. He's a humanitarian of of the first order and is certainly known for his exploits on behalf of Americans and certainly American POWs for years and years to come, sir. I would certainly defer to the committee and your wishes if you had somebody better. And
his work in this area is legend. I admire the man's commitment to this. I'm just, as a matter of public policy, these tombstones come about as a result of the press doing the tombstone, but to put the tombstone in the legislation seems to me to give it a less bipartisan, a less objective approach. It seems like we are memorializing an individual rather than the cause, so to speak.
Thank you, sir. Well, that was certainly not my intention, sir. I was just trying. I don't know how it comes about, how these commissions are generally formed. I've not participated in it before, but as example, Secretary Rogers being named chairman, that's...
Yeah, but the press named it the Rogers Commission, not the president. That's the Presidential Commission.
I see.
This ought to be the Congressional Commission.
Yes,
to
sir.
Focus attention on Congress as a whole rather than an individual. One gets the impression that we are probably focusing an attention on an individual whose work in this area is remarkable and for which I have great deal of admiration, but it just seems to me it might be more objective to just have the Congressional Commission.
Well, I appreciate your comments.
Thank you very much.
I might add, sir, and I appreciate your support very much.
Yes.
This commission is envisioned by me and by the co-sponsors. This is no witch hunt, sir. This is to determine, and I think it's critical, you and Mr. Chairman and all the members of the committee, at this point, at this critical juncture, if you will, when things are beginning to look better, I think, without raising any false hopes of any families or anyone, I think it's critically important that we know, are they there?
Well, as you know, I have a great deal of influence on the chairman.
Yes.
And I'm going to see to it that he gives you a good hearing with Mr. Solomon's support. I'm sure you'll get your bill out.
Well, thank you. I think Mr. Solomon would like to speak to that, perhaps. He likes perhaps a presidential commission better than a congressional.
I yield to the gentleman from New Jersey.
I too, on your efforts of legislation, in your persistence, which is a credit to the Congress and the country, in the pursuit of the issue and the fate of these lost Americans. I'd only wanted to make the simple point that some time ago, after I know Mr. Solomon was in Vietnam, the point was made that if the Vietnamese were somehow now changing their position when they alluded to the fact that there very well might be Americans alive in Vietnam. I thought it might be helpful for you to know that when Mr. Solars and I were in Vietnam a year before, we heard really the identical language. And it was at least my impression that the point they were trying to make was to cover themselves in the event that there were Americans who were in Laos or Vietnam but not in custody. In the event that someone, through some circumstances, walks off a hill somewhere or out of a jungle. But in the American media, it was interpreted that perhaps somehow this was a change in the Vietnamese position. That was not my interpretation, since from what I read in the press, the language given to Mr. Solomon was similar to what came to us, and I thought that might be helpful if I added it at this point. I thank the gentleman for your...
I know Mr. Solomon is waiting eagerly to testify, but I believe the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, wanted to make an observation.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a brief comment. First of all, associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Leach relative to Mr. Hendon's clear leadership on this issue. It's not that the information may not have been there. Excuse me. It's what has been done with the information and whether or not it has been bucked up to the proper levels. And I think you have been a lightning rod in this process in motivating not only Congress but also the executive branch to ensure that they have done everything humanly possible with each live sighting. And I think for that you deserve the greatest credit and commendation from this task force and from members of the Congress. And I congratulate you.
Ms. Hendon, I want to thank you for coming before us today and giving us the benefit of your views on this. Let me assure you that I have an open mind on this issue. I want to hear what those who were most responsible for dealing with this problem inside and outside the administration have to say about it. I'm obviously interested in the views of the President, Secretary of Defense, State, the League of Families, our colleagues in the Congress, the head of the task force, and after evaluating what they have to say, we will then decide what to do with your legislation. But I do thank you for all of the time you've put into this and for coming before us today.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, sir, and I would like to say as I leave that obviously there are many, you mentioned statements referring to members of Congress for supporting or not supporting. There are a number of things, as you know, Mr. Chairman, this is a pretty rough business, and a number of things said about people on both sides. I, no more than you, Mr. Chairman, have control about any statements made about any member or about me. There have been a number of shots taken at me, and that's part of the business, Mr. Chairman. But I certainly have the greatest respect for you and every member of this body, whether they support our legislation or not. And I'm very grateful.
I'm pleased to hear you say that, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now hear from Congressman Solomon, who chairs the task force on POW and MIAs. He will, are we having the others come up at the same time? Or, yeah. And if Congressman Gilman, if they're present, Congressman Dornan, McEwen, and Bilirakis can join him. We will hear first from Mr. Solomon. Let me just say that, Jerry, I think that you have made a great contribution to this cause through your chairmanship of the task force. You're not a Johnny-come-lately to this issue. You've been concerned about it for many years. But I've been enormously impressed with the statesmanlike way in which you've conducted yourself, your energy, the sense of responsibility you've brought to it, your self-evident determination and commitment on this question. It's been a real pleasure for me to work with you. And what I think means the most to me is that you've been able to demonstrate that in spite of some profound political and ideological differences which we may have on other issues, that on a matter like this, it's possible for people at different ends of the ideological and political spectrum to work hand in hand on behalf of our common objectives. That's what makes this place work. It's why America has survived for 200 years as a bastion of freedom and democracy. And let no one abroad ever think that despite our momentary differences from time to time, that on matters of profound interest and concern to this nation, that we're incapable of joining hands and working together in the interests of the nation we all love. So I want to thank you for your really great work, and I now look forward to hearing your testimony and particularly your report on your recent mission to Hanoi.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for those flattering remarks. And as a matter of fact, I have in my pocket an editorial that appeared in the, Los Angeles Times, which says that you and I are getting together quite often lately on many issues. I don't know about that, but
if it didn't appear in the upstate or downstate press in New York, we'd both be in political trouble.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I concur in your remarks, and I feel the same way about you, sincerely. And I also thank you for authorizing the task force to take the trip, which we did, to Vietnam, and I can assure you that it was a most productive mission. Let me just say briefly, without written testimony, that our official report will go into detail on the entire trip and will include our meeting with the Joint Casualty Resolution Center. It will include the Central Identification Laboratory, and will also include our meeting with Korean officials regarding MIAs for the Korean conflict, meetings with the Thai officials on narcotics, which I think Ben Gilman will speak to a little later, and our meetings with the Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees on the Thai border. However, I'd like to spend most of my time to discuss our meeting with the Vietnamese officials in Hanoi on the POW-MIA issue. And our primary mission, Mr. Chairman, was to emphasize that the American people, as well as the President, placed the highest possible priority on resolving the MIA issue, not just the remains of American servicemen, but also the question of identifying live Americans and securing their return if they indeed wish to return. And after 2 days of intensive meetings, it became very obvious to all of the members of the task force that a significant change of attitude was developing on the part of the Vietnamese government, a change that began to take place about 18 months ago, as Mr. Torricelli had previously stated. For years, the Vietnamese government had always tried to link war reparations and diplomatic recognition with any kind of cooperation at all, to a high point of hostility when we refused to allow that kind of linkage to take place. And this time, Mr. Chairman, during our meeting, the Vietnamese government repeatedly, time after time, insisted that there was no linkage, but that they were cooperating purely for humanitarian reasons. There are obviously reasons for this which might be covered later on in a question and answer period, just as the total economic chaos and the fact that defectors have a lot to do with maybe their change of attitude. The most significant change of attitude came when, after years of insisting that there are no live Americans in Vietnam, none whatsoever, they stated clearly, not only to members of the delegation, but to the press that covered it as well, that there were still no live Americans that they were aware of, but that there could be some in the mountains or in the caves. And, Mr. Chairman, that's significant. That's a significant variance from what they have said before. I think the second most significant change came when, after previously refusing to accept any reports of live sightings, they all of a sudden agreed to not only accept and investigate these live sighting reports, but also to allow U.S. personnel to participate in those investigations. And that, Mr. Chairman, is significantly important. In response to our delegation's request to speed up or to accelerate the previously agreed to 2-year period of accountability on the POW/MIA issue, we were informed and indeed showed proof that they were already attempting to do just that by having 3 teams in the field who would soon be reporting to our technical team on some 70 cases, which we will be hearing more on the results of this meeting from testimony given later by the administration witnesses. Now, Mr. Chairman, I could go on at length when we have a crowded schedule of people here to testify this afternoon, plus other committee business to conduct on the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, so I will defer the rest of my testimony to our final written report. But let me just conclude by saying that, in my opinion, I believe all of the task force members concur that we do not in any way want to raise false hopes of the families of MIAs, and we must be extremely careful that any statements we make on the issue are totally factual and are not based on assumptions and are not based on circumstantial evidence that could be misleading to some of these families. You, Mr. Chairman, Acting Chairman, brought that up yourself, and that is terribly, terribly important. And if you talk to members of these families, they will reinforce that. For instance, I must say that I personally have no actual proof that there are Americans being held against their will in Vietnam. I have a gut feeling that there is. But I do believe that there are Americans in Vietnam under other circumstances as well. And therefore, the question is not, are there Americans there? The question is, how many of them are there? Who are they? Where are they? Do they want to come home? And if so, then for God's sakes, let's bring them home. That's what we're here for, and that's what every member of the task force was trying to impart to the Vietnamese government on our trip there. And I thank the chairman for giving me this time. I am going to run off to another human rights subcommittee that I have to be at for a few minutes. In the meantime, Congressman Gilman and other members of the staff will be glad to testify, and I'll return as soon as I can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gilman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to once again thank the chairman for affording the POW/MIA task force the opportunity for reporting on the progress of the work of our task force in accounting for our missing Americans in Southeast Asia, and to comment on the proposal, legislative proposal, being advanced by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hendon. Our task force, having recently returned from our mission to Hanoi and to the JCRC, the Joint Casualty Resolution Center in Hawaii, and the CIL, the Casualty Identification Laboratory there, finds that these hearings come in an especially timely and appropriate manner. And permit me at this time to commend those members who participated in our last mission and utilized our recess to travel to Hanoi to further accelerate our efforts, including the gentleman from New York, our chairman, Mr. Solomon, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dornan, gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hendon, gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Smith, the gentleman from New Jersey, Chris Smith, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. McCluskey, gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Rowland, myself, all of whom are present today. At the outset, let me reiterate my firm belief that our administration, for the first time since the end of the war, is seeking to give this issue the kind of priority status that it truly deserves. And I believe that significant progress has been made on the issue during the past 12 months. More progress, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, than during any other year since the conclusion of hostilities, a result of the President's efforts and the administration's firm and determined commitment. Our recent mission to Hanoi, I believe, was a positive step in the process toward resolving the MIA POW issue. Although we were initially disturbed about not having the opportunity to meet with Foreign Minister Tak, we did find Deputy Minister Wang Bik-son to be highly knowledgeable, cooperative, and in a position of authority. The atmosphere of our meetings, which were generally friendly and responsive, I think left all of us with the impression that the Vietnamese are sincere about fulfilling their commitment to trying to resolve this critical issue within a 2-year time frame, as they've indicated publicly. And we welcome that sort of expanded cooperation. Americans at some future date. And I think the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Torricelli, was right on point with reference to that impression that we all have. This impression is further fostered by the Vietnamese inclusion of post-war insurgents, and I quote, "and American infiltrators," as part of their criteria and definitions of possible live Americans in Vietnam at the present time. They also indicate that they may very well be Americans in areas not under their control, in the mountains and in the caves of Vietnam or in Laos. Although I've been critical in the past of some laxity by our intelligence and defense agencies in following through in certain cases, upon the whole, I'm pleased with the administration's accelerated attention to the POW-MIA issue. And I certainly applaud the addition of Ross Perot and General Tai as consultants to the Defense Department in this effort. I do question the need for the proposal, therefore, for an independent presidential commission at the very time when we appear to be making significant headway with Hanoi. I don't think we should be sending out any signals that we're not supportive of our administration's efforts and that we are divided on this issue. Creating such a commission would only be duplicative of the present work of our administration. Furthermore, I believe that the creation of another commission and the shifting of responsibilities to that commission could delay and impede rather than accelerate our negotiation. Gut feeling that Americans can very well be held captive in Southeast Asia at the present time. But I'm also quick to admit that to date, we've received no hard evidence to substantiate the present captivity of any specific Americans or their whereabouts. The Vietnamese admissions at our meetings that Americans may still be alive in areas not within their control may be a face-saving means of returning some live Americans at some future date. And I think the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Torricelli, was right on point with reference to that impression that we all have. This impression is further fostered by the Vietnamese inclusion of post-war insurgents, and I quote, "and American infiltrators," as part of their criteria and definitions of possible live Americans in Vietnam at the present time. They also indicate that they may very well be Americans in areas not under their control, in the mountains and in the caves of Vietnam or in Laos. Although I've been critical in the past of some laxity by our intelligence and defense agencies in following through in certain cases, upon the whole, I'm pleased with the administration's accelerated attention to the POW-MIA issue. And I certainly applaud the addition of Ross Perot and General Tai as consultants to the Defense Department in this effort. I do question the need for the proposal, therefore, for an independent presidential commission at the very time when we appear to be making significant headway with Hanoi. I don't think we should be sending out any signals that we're not supportive of our administration's efforts and that we are divided on this issue. Creating such a commission would only be duplicative of the present work of our administration. Furthermore, I believe that the creation of another commission and the shifting of responsibilities to that commission could delay and impede rather than accelerate our negotiations with Hanoi. In conclusion, I want to thank our subcommittee chairman and our committee colleagues for their sustained and valued support of the work of our task force on POWs and MIAs. I want to thank our colleagues who've taken the time to appear and testify today.
Thank you. Colleague from California.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief comment and perhaps a question. Mr. Gilman, I agree with everything you just said, and I want to remind the people in this room that for a long time you have been working on this issue. And of course, Chairman Solomon is the chairman now, but you were before him, and for all of these many years you have been, as I have, on this task force. And I know that many of the upgrading steps that have been taken in the Defense Department and in the other intelligence departments relating to this issue have come at your direct request and demand in some cases. I think the people should be aware of that there has been a lot of progress. There is a much different viewpoint on this than there was just 5 years ago, for sure. I would like to just ask how you view the appointment of Perot and Tai as consultants, how that might affect the proposal that's before us today.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his kind remarks, and I have certainly held with a great deal of respect the gentleman's own commitment and pursuit of this issue for so many years, as you and I sat side by side and tried to evince additional evidence and to try to pursue this issue in every manner possible. We have seen a great turnabout, and I'm elated that we're now seeing a firm commitment from so many directions. I certainly welcome the addition of General Tai, who's made some very strong remarks with regard to the possibility of live Americans being out there, and Ross Perot, who's undertaken some initiatives on his own over the years and has indicated a strong commitment. I think that they can only serve to help and to be of assistance to the administration people, to our team that have been working on this very critical and very frustrating problem over the years.
It occurs to me that neither one of these men being patsies or anybody's tool certainly will report to us if they find any reason at all to think that the effort that's going on now is not the kind of effort that most of us believe it to be. And at that time we can decide whether something else needs to be done, it seemed to me.
I think they'll become very strong members of this team, and I would assume that Mr. Hendon certainly welcomes that direction that the administration has taken, since it's something that he's been suggesting.
Thank
you. Yeah. Any further questions? If not, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I'll take only a few minutes to share my principal thoughts and concerns on the MIA POW issue with you, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions members of the subcommittee may have. I've submitted a more formal written statement for the record. First, Mr. Chairman, I am pleased with the progress that has been made by this administration in bringing about greater cooperation from the Vietnamese and Laotians in resolving this most pressing issue. I believe the root of this new cooperativeness is self-interest on the part of the Vietnamese, who are quite obviously interested in improved economic and diplomatic relations despite the fact that they have agreed to resolve the POW-MIA issue on humanitarian grounds without linkage to any other issue between our countries. We should continue, I think, to pursue expanded cooperation. Second, I remain concerned that there is a lack of correlation, Mr. Chairman, and I really would like to emphasize this issue, a lack of correlation amongst the various agencies involved in this issue. Family members of the missing have expressed doubts that they have received all information about their loved one, and although a mechanism is in place to ensure that all information is available to them, I am not convinced it's totally effective in practice. As an example, a constituent of mine has just recently received a copy of an old memo written by her husband's company commander, which states that wallets, watches, rings, dog tags, and other personal remains were found on the bodies of her husband's fallen platoon. I'd like to read the last paragraph of this multi-page memo. It's a memo that was written by then Major Kenneth W. Pipes of U.S. Marine Corps, and it was addressed to Colonel F.C. Caldwell, U.S. Marine Corps, Head Historical Branch, G3 Division, Headquarters, U.S. Marine Corps, Washington. Last paragraph. On approximately 1 April 1968, when we recovered our MIAs, we found the men who died on 25 February bore no evidence of NVA brutality or disfigurement. Their wallets, watches, rings, and dog tags remained with the men where they fell. Their weapons were, to the best of my knowledge, all recovered. Was this a tribute to the NVA to those brave men? Or was this a tribute by the NVA to those brave men, he asks? Perhaps. Certainly 6 weeks on the battlefield gave them ample opportunity to claim the spoils of war. This memo was rather shocking news to my constituent. No personal effects will return to her. No personal effects will return to her when her husband and 7 other men were classified, killed in action, body recovered, and buried in a mass grave. My question is, why is this the first she has seen of this information? And I also raise the question, which must be answered, Mr. Chairman, why was he classified KIA-BR, body recovered? His remains have never been identified. I wonder how many more fall in the same category. The last point I want to make is that I'm convinced there are live Americans who remain in Southeast Asia, both against their will and voluntarily. The many refugee reports of live sightings and the ambivalent response of Vietnamese and Laotian officials to questions about live Americans are the basis for this conclusion. As you know, charges have been made that the government has not done all it can to verify reports of live Americans and secure their release. These are serious charges, and I am participating in Senate hearings looking into these allegations. Secretary Armitage, General Perutz, and Secretary Wolfowitz told the committee that they welcome our investigations, and I commend them for this open attitude. It's in everyone's best interest to get to the bottom of these charges, Mr. Chairman. We all agree to that, and get on with the task at hand, which is securing the release of American POWs and repatriating the remains of those who died on foreign soil. We must not lose sight of this goal. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I just, in the interest of time, because our administration witnesses have to leave shortly and they haven't even had a chance to testify yet, I have 2 questions. First, are you suggesting that there has been any kind of a cover-up within the administration or the DIA with respect to information which would suggest we have MIAs still alive in Indochina?
I haven't seen any specific evidence that would lead me to believe that there has been a concentrated, planned type of a cover-up. I am satisfied, however, that there are so many different departments and so many different agencies working on this issue, and that there is a lack of correlation, a lack of coordination and cooperation among them. That in itself might seem like a little bit of a cover-up. I think it's probably more lack of efficiency, even though each individual department or agency probably is pretty well efficient.
But you're not suggesting any kind of a conspiracy to prevent information from becoming public, which would relate to the existence of people who once served in the armed forces who are still alive and in the
I wouldn't say that I'm suggesting that. I suppose I know that there have been people for years who have maintained that there are no live Americans in Southeast Asia, and I suppose human nature might dictate that some of those people would feel that they would look bad and be embarrassed if their evidence is to the contrary, but I wouldn't say that there's any concentrated effort towards that end.
And finally, could you tell us what your position is on this legislation that's been introduced by Congressman Hendon to establish a commission to investigate?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your asking me that. I co-sponsored the legislation. I've heard the arguments. I've read the arguments against it. Mr. Gilman's arguments certainly are good ones. I've heard them before. I think it comes down to the bottom line of, really this is a government of the people. And it is the people, I think, the rank and file, at least as I find it in my district, who really have a sense of credibility, a lack of credibility, a sense of a lack of credibility, if you will, a lack of believability in our government as far as this area is concerned. And I think it is they who are basically insisting on a disinterested type of a group that not connected with the government in any direct way. And I think we owe them that. I think we owe the families that. I think we owe our GIs who might still be alive over there, and I believe we owe that to the American people.
Are you aware that the League of Families, which represents most of the families, is opposed to the establishment?
I am aware of that.
Well, then it's not clear to me in what sense we owe it to the families if the families themselves don't want it.
Well, you and I represent 500,000 to 600,000 people back home. I would wager that we probably don't necessarily always vote with them on a 100% type of a basis. I read the rank and file people back home as wanting to see this type of a commission.
Right. Thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, we will hear from my very good friend and distinguished colleague on this committee, a former chairman of the task force, has worked tirelessly on this issue, Mr. Dornan. Bob, I hope I won't be reported to Amnesty International for violating your human rights if I ask you to be brief, but we do have administration witnesses waiting, and
even Amnesty International Incorporated would concede that that is a legitimate request of me, not in the category of even mild harassment or torture.
There's nobody whom I enjoy listening to more on the floor. When you're in full flight,
I'm glad you said
that. It's a spectacle to behold.
Well, let me throttle back to about 85%.
It's like watching someone on a high wire without a safety net underneath.
Well, I've decided that performing an afterburner is sometimes not the best way to go. Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, first of all, let me say, without the efforts of newer members to this Congress, without some young blood involved in an issue that does truthfully have a burnout factor attached to it, without the efforts of specifically Mr. Bill Hendon of North Carolina, I don't believe that retired Lieutenant General Eugene Tai or Mr. Ross Perot, an Annapolis graduate, would be coming to the efforts at the Pentagon as consultants. And I believe that alone is a major accomplishment, and I think it grows out of Mr. Hendon's suggestion that we have a Perot commission, something that I resisted joining for over a year as I weighed all the factors, and I'm proud to be one of those co-sponsors now. I just, in trying to be brief, want to put this a little bit in perspective for our friends in the press and for other people even newer to this issue. In the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, I was looking at the newly returned ID cards, and I looked at a serial number, and for a second I thought it was my serial number. It was Air Officer 303-8260. Mine ends in 71. And I realized I was looking at the card of a classmate of mine who stood in the first line of cadets with me when I got my wings years ago in Texas. David Allison was shot down in an F-105 over downtown Hanoi. And like many of my personal friends, his remains, or he himself alive, was taken in the environs of the city of Hanoi. And there are still some of these cases that are not resolved. We looked at the 7 sets of remains. One of those sets had been expanded to 2 because the skull did not match the bones. And I believe they've had a successful identification on both of those. When we looked at these remains, one of the younger members said, shouldn't we have a prayer? And it was very fitting because we were looking at the remains of young American heroes who had tried to keep a small part of Asia free and had tried to prevent that killing fields that developed in Cambodia. Before we left, I had an opportunity to meet with the son of one of my roommates in the Air Force, the longest known POW in Laos, second longest, David Herdlicka, Charlie Shelton being the longest. I've just heard from his wife over the week. Young David Herdlicka is a naval officer flying now as a pilot down in Texas. He called me after we got back to put to rest a rumor from one of the people on the trip. He said the rumor was circulating through some of the family members in Texas that we had been handed photographs as we boarded our airplane in Hanoi, photographs of live Americans, and were told they'd be home soon. Now, that's how bad the rumor level reached before our plane had ever come back to Andrews Air Force Base. I was asked to call into a Denver talk show, and I find on the air with me Leo Herdlicka, the brother of my friend in the Air Force, David's uncle, and Mark Smith, who had worked with his wife when all we had to go on with Captain Smith was that he was shot 7 times, left for dead at Loc Ninh, and lo and behold, he turned up in the South and has come home. I see his reputation being shredded. I see the reputations of people who have flown hundreds of combat missions in Southeast Asia because they're confused and still hurt by this issue, lieutenant colonels with more decorations than anyone else there, fighter pilot squadron commanders. I see these people being ripped, and it's because the agony of this issue has gone on for 13 years and 2 months. If you added 13 years and 2 months to the end of World War II, it would be November '53. It would have been since July that we signed a ceasefire then, and there we left behind 389 healthy men in prison, not debilitated, no anemic dysentery, no head or body wounds, no amputations. 389 healthy, strong people, and we all got rebriefed on that in Korea on the way home. Now, I have 2 suggestions to you as our chairman and as the really super chairman of this task force. And I mean that both ways, literally and structurally. This burnout factor happened to me. And I've had family members come to me over the last 3 years and say, Bob, you're not involved anymore. And I didn't realize it. I had been burned out. And I've been re-energized by some of the younger members in this trip. Sure has me back up to 100%, if not an afterburner. And here are my 2 suggestions. I believe everybody who's worked on this is honorable, but I've met some people burned out in the Pentagon, civilians and military. And when someone is a POW, and I'm not referring to anybody specifically, but I've seen POWs returned home, honorable men who've given more to this country than anybody since World War II, except those that gave the full measure of devotion in their life. I've seen them burned out, and they know the communist enemy from inside in Hanoi as well as anyone I've ever seen. I suggest we simply ask a question of everyone involved and accept the honorable answer they give. And that question is this. There are detectives who are just putting in their time on police forces all around the world. And then there are good detectives who have an inclination to this type of work. I would ask these people, we're now looking, because of 13 years and 2 months, for natural good detectives. If your intuition, question I wouldn't ask for a person going to any other job in the bureaucracy or military worldwide, if your intuition tells you that no one could have survived 13 years and that there probably is no one left there alive, step aside, go on to a less agonizing profession and one that probably has more career advancement opportunity. Don't put yourself into this job and inflict yourself to potential burnout if you are not a natural detective on this and if you haven't come to the intuitive conviction that there are live Americans in Indochina. That's one. If we put that to everybody involved, honorable people would step aside and we'd have people willing to fill those shoes who might bring something new blood at least, to the issue. Number 2 is a direct request of you that I mentioned at committee hearings before. I believe former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger is an honorable man. But honorable men, whether they're ship commanders or secretaries of state or presidents of the United States or platoon sergeants or squad leaders, can make an honorable decision that gets their men killed. And I believe that Mr. Kissinger in Paris, with Bud McFarlane at his side, with Bill Rogers as his boss, and with President Nixon in the White House, I believe he got skinned alive in Paris. 29 days after the last B-52 pulled off the targets of North Vietnam, with no SAMs left to shoot, no MiGs left in the air, what's taught in military schools as total air supremacy and a war won. 29 days later, we took the list of the defeated enemy and did not demand that our list be fulfilled, including people like Ron Dodge, of whom we had photographs in captivity. And there are people in this room that witnessed me at the League meeting in 1972, just a few months before Paris, warn them, predict exactly this agony we'd go through, although I had no idea it would last 13 years. And I warned them then, get their input to Paris and get our list used, not the list of the communists. And because of that, I beg you to bring before this task force Mr. Kissinger, as a man of honor, to explain what happened in Paris on one country specifically and the whole scene in general. And I'll close with this line. I am convinced we left 100 aviators behind in Laos and some ground people. 100 men. Bill Hendon jogged my memory on the stated testimony that they were there of communists, and then he jogged my memory on something I'd completely forgotten. We kept bombing in Laos till August of '73. How in God's name did Henry Kissinger think the Laotian communists, the Pathet Lao, holding their own treasured pearls or gold bullion, as they referred to our prisoners when I was there several times in the late 60s, early 70s, how did we think they would return our prisoners through Paris when they were being bombed for months to come? Please get Mr. Kissinger before this committee in closed session if we want, and find out just what went wrong with Laos, because that is the area of most concern to the parents.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your testimony, and we will certainly give very serious consideration to your suggestions. I'm sure we'll be talking about it further. I gather from your testimony you do favor this legislation to establish the commission.
I do, but it may not be necessary any further because of the coming on board of Mr. Perot, an unusual American, and because of Eugene Tye's participation. But once Mr. Tye is back on board, I want him to share with all of my fellow members photographs that I became aware of in 1969 that I requested and he showed to me.
So in other words, with Mr. Perot and Mr. Tye back on board, as it were, your personal preference would be for us to wait a while before moving forward?
Not necessarily. I said I speculate it may not be necessary. However, I think maybe too much time has gone by. And as I explained to the communists in Hanoi, if they think they're having problems from Vietnamese who have become Americans, these Rambo and missing in action movies are generating hatred among a whole new generation of Americans because they're not solving this problem. And it may take the skill of a personal American businessman, the way Moscow has always been intrigued with Arm & Hammer. They may be so intrigued with Mr. Perot, separate from the government, that things might happen with him as the head of a commission that would not happen in the bureaucracy.
Are there any other questions? If not, Bob, thank you very much for coming, sharing your thoughts with us. We'll now have Secretary Armitage, General Perutz, and Secretary Manjo join us so that we can hear from the administration. I know that Secretary Armitage has to leave at 4, I believe, or 4:15. 4. So, Rich, maybe you want to lead off. Your statement will be included in the record. Let me urge each of you, if you can, in order to expedite things, in your testimony, if you haven't already planned to do so, please address yourself to the question of this legislation introduced by Mr. Hendon, whether you think the establishment of a commission would serve a useful purpose or whether you think it would be unproductive or counterproductive, and why.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be, as you suggest, very brief, and I will address that question. You asked me in this appearance to bring the committee, subcommittee, up to speed on what has happened since the last testimony in front of this committee by my deputy, Mr. Jim Kelly. In August of 1985, the Vietnamese returned 26 sets of remains. 24 of those have been positively ID'd. One was as Americans who were missing. One set of remains ID'd as a Mongoloid, and the 26th is as yet unidentified. In December of 1985, a further repatriation of 7 remains 5 of whom will begin their final journey home tomorrow from Honolulu. We have successfully identified 5. 2 remain yet to be identified. Following on my own discussions in Hanoi and the excellent work of Codell's Murkowski and Solomon, we had a technical talk in Hanoi, which was completed on the 27th and the 28th of February, the results of which are as follows. The Vietnamese briefed our team on what they referred to as 49 MIAs. The results are that they will, in the very near future, we trust within about 3 weeks, be returning 21 sets of remains of people, or remains that they believe to be American, 10 of whom have tentative identifications associated with the remains. Additionally, the Vietnamese took us to a crash site which has been heretofore unexplored and indicated that it was a candidate for a unilateral excavation by them. We have recently in Laos completed our second successful excavation. We've got a considerable quantity of remains which were recovered, and those have been returned to the sill, and we will be conducting an investigation. That's for the update, sir. Finally, on the question of a presidential commission, to say that the remarks of Congressman Gilman are very much my own, and I would like to only add to him the following. Duplication, I believe there would be a bit of duplication in this. We might lose more time, and we've lost much too much already, in bringing members up to speed. But I think that the final point is this. The Indochinese governments cannot be allowed to think that they can get a better deal or create a better condition for themselves by waiting for another body to deliberate on the issue. We believe there has been some progress on this issue, slow, agonizing progress, but progress nonetheless. We don't want to sacrifice that at all. And the appearance of a presidential commission, frankly, Mr. Chairman, is that one that looks inward. And the problem is in Indochina. It's in Vietnam, it's in Laos, and it's in Cambodia. They hold the key. And I think the effort should be directed that way. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mr. Manjo?
Chairman, first let me bring you greetings from Paul Wolfowitz, who will be sworn in as Ambassador to Indonesia at 4:15, and Gaston Segura, who will be his replacement there. One or both wish they could be with you, but they have otherwise occupied this particular day.
Okay, give him our best wishes and congratulations, and tell him I hope to see him in Jakarta later in the year.
Well, I think he looks forward to that also.
Is that a threat or a promise, Mr. Chairman?
The points that I have made in some detail, which I beg to be put into the record, I think have been largely summarized by what Rich has said and what Congressman Gilman has said. I believe if one looks back, I've been working at this for about 2.5 years now, one can see quite a bit of progress. We are, with the Vietnamese, who have agreed that it's a humanitarian problem, we are moving somewhere, we are getting somewhere. They have, as has been pointed out, that the congressional delegations have gone out there. They've moved their position some, they've opened it up some. With Laos, we've established a degree of cooperation which was unheard of several years ago. I believe that we are working in the right direction, and that the way the team we have, of which the Congress has been an important part, is making some progress. I only fear that establishment of a new body, whatever the good motivation it might have, would send a signal to the countries in Indochina. They would stand back, they would hold back, they'd wait to see what might be different, whether they could make different arrangements. It's been rather carefully worked out, the difference between the humanitarian issue and the Cambodia issue, which is a political issue. I think they might stand back and wait, and certainly we don't want waiting. We want to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Perutz?
Mr. Chairman.
Your testimony will be included in the record. In the interest of time, if you can briefly summarize, we can have the maximum time for questioning.
I'm pleased to be here. I'm relatively new, and I welcome the chance, though, to assure you and the members of the committee that the POW-MIA issue is my highest priority. I was, in my testimony that will be made a matter of record, there's a rather detailed review of how we go about working the various cases and the number of dedicated people that we have now. Dedicated, I say that in a very sincere way. We're up to, in the POW-MIA office, we're up now to 23 people working in the office, 18 authorized. I've added 4 more until we can hire, and I've got some of my best analysts down there. That's almost 5 times the number of people working that was working at the time. My very good friend Gene Tai was the director of DIA. Within DIA, that office is the prime intelligence collection analysis arm in support of the government-wide effort, and it's staffed by people who are committed to resolving this sensitive issue in a forthright and expeditious manner, and we owe it to the families and the nation and ourselves to follow every lead, to resolve every discrepancy, and to ensure the President's pledge to the nation on this issue is fulfilled. I promise you I won't let myself get burned out. If I do, I'll step aside. In addition to the special office resource pool that we use to work this problem, Mr. Chairman, we are regularly assisted on a worldwide basis by U.S. government photographic interpreters, linguists, investigatory personnel from all the agencies, and other intelligence specialists. For example, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which I manage, is continually tasked to pursue leads as appropriate. During this year alone, we've tasked military attachés in 20 countries, foreign countries, with hundreds of messages to pursue leads emanating from live sightings and other POW reporting. I'd just like to tell you some things that we've done since I've come on board in an effort to determine whether there are any shortfalls in the way we're doing business, and there always is in something this big, to fix those shortfalls, to provide the proper oversight to ensure that no one, whether he's a burned-out analyst who's been there too long or whether someone is overtaxed, will have the opportunity to make a judgment that's not a proper judgment. In that regard, I have established a DIA senior-level task force to analyze cases, do quality control over the analysts that are working this problem, and to make final judgments on the disposition of cases. And as has already been stated numerous times, I have invited, and I invited General Tai at no pressure from anybody. Early on, he agreed. The first week I was director of DIA. We culminated the terms of reference, and the letters went out yesterday. Mr. Ross Perot has agreed to serve as appropriate. He's busy right now, but he's agreed to come on board, and he's got a blank check to do that, and he will. And of course, what we've asked them to do is to give a complete review of all reports since the time he was the director, so that he can publicly make a judgment, make a statement regarding the basis for any reports that he had seen then and what his views are currently. And he has every right to do that, and I'm sure he will for this committee and for anybody else. I've also proposed to the Director of Central Intelligence the establishment of a formal interagency intelligence senior-level committee to review current intelligence community efforts because of this possibility that we're not dealing from the same deck and in the intelligence community, and possibility that perhaps we have not exhausted every collection possibility. And so these people meet, this is high level, general officer level, to see if there's anything we could be doing that we haven't done in the past. There is nothing that we will do that we won't do to improve on our collection, evaluation, dissemination, support to the families, support to any group that's interested. Any congressman is absolutely invited to take the time to come down for a briefing to Congressman Hendon, God bless him, takes the time to do that, and he's perhaps the most knowledgeable of all the congressmen. I almost have a staff that supports him on a regular basis, but I invite that kind of review by any congressman on either side of the aisle. I hope you understand that many people, elements, and institutions are involved in and assist our efforts. We do not, however, operate simply with internal oversight. Review and oversight begins at the working level, where all personnel are professional intelligence officers. The review procedures ascend to the senior management level within my Directorate of Operations. Additionally, all DI analysis disseminated to the agencies and individuals having an interest in PW affairs. External overseas include the National Security Council, DODISA, JCS, the military services, the Joint Casualty Resolution Center in Hawaii, and the current executive director of the National League of Families. In addition, we are subject to legislation oversight by the Senate Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, your House Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, the Task Force on American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia, and the Select Committee on Intelligence. In addition to this normal system of checks and balances, DIA has had extensive, in-depth investigations of their analytical process and of allegations of a cover-up. I think while it takes a few moments to do it, it's important to go on the record once again that in 1984, the House Task Force conducted an almost year-long investigation into these conspiracy and cover-up charges. It was their conclusion that these allegations had indeed no basis in fact. Further, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence reviewed DIA's handling of live sighting reports before my time and determined that a careful, thorough, and professional effort is being made and the charges of conspiracy and cover-up are unfounded. Within the agency, the MIA Special Office has had 2 Inspector General investigations within the past 18 months, both prior to my becoming the director of DIA. One of these was part of a normal DIA IG cycle. The other was conducted by the IG at the request of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in response to assertions that the Defense Intelligence Agency was involved in cover-up and, most of all, abuse of refugee sources. It was also the conclusion of these investigations that such allegations had no basis in fact. In a further attempt to put these allegations to rest, the former director of DIA in 1985 ordered senior analysts from several intelligence disciplines to review the professional standards of internal operating procedures, and they judged the effort there to be carried out with high competence. I'm never satisfied. I'm not sure we can't improve, and as I'm talking today, I've ordered that a senior task force review the functions and the methodology currently being used by our special office. They have been given their charter by me directly. None of these efforts have been without the cost of diverting significant resources, but we believe it critical to have the full confidence of the families, the Congress, and the American people. I told them, start from scratch, see if there's anything in the bookkeeping, see if there's anything in the database, follow-up actions, etc. I'm just simply going to end by saying that we are leaning forward in the cockpit. We have a group of bright-eyed, dedicated people. We've added a lot of people. We understand our responsibilities. And in commenting on the need for a committee or a commission, I'd first say that if anybody thought that if a commission was established, we would do what we can to make that transition just as clean as possible, and we would support it to the fullest. However, I see no need. It may indeed be detrimental from various aspects. First of all, I hope we've made the point that attention is being given at the highest level. I can assure you, and I'm sure my colleagues can assure you, that the President, the Vice President themselves take a personal interest in what we're doing every day, that we will be sending the wrong message to 2 different groups. I, for one, believe that there'll be possibly the wrong message to the American people. That is that since the change is required, perhaps there has been a cover-up. I submit, Mr. Chairman, there hasn't been a cover-up. There hasn't been a cover-up. Most importantly, I'm not sure that a commission could do the job as well. 99% of the information that will have to be used are intelligence reports. It'd have to come through the same intelligence apparatus that I direct now. I'm going to look out for that. I'm going to pursue it. I'm going to extend myself and my resources. And finally, I think it might send the wrong signal to the other side. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General. I'm delighted we've had a chance to meet now. I expect we'll be working closely in the future. Let me ask each of you if you could very briefly let us know what significance you attach to the statements that were made to the delegation led by Congressman Solomon by the Vietnamese, in which they indicated that there might be Americans still alive in Vietnam. How significant a statement was this, and what conclusions, if any, do you draw from it?
I have to admit a great deal of enthusiasm when the reports first reached us. That enthusiasm has been somewhat dampened by subsequent official statements from Hanoi in an attempt apparently to clarify their statements to Codell Solomon, in which they stated that if there are any Americans alive in the hills or the caves, they are either stay-behind agents or, I believe they used the term CIA implants, infiltrators. So I thought originally we had some
movement on their part, but I think they've gone back into a more intransigent position on that. So I found more encouragement, however, from another statement they made to Congressman Solomon, and that was the willingness to discuss the possibility of Americans assisting them and being with them when they conducted live sighting investigations.
Yeah. General Perutz, what's your assessment?
I have very little to add, except that I was encouraged. I'm always encouraged. I'm an optimist, and I think that someday we're going to walk some kid out of there.
But you agree with Secretary Armige's assessment of?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, Mr. Manjo?
I agree, and I'm looking forward to see how we can work with them to get that joint effort.
Right. Mr. Armitage, have recent Rambo excursions or cross-border forays into Vietnam or Laos affected our negotiations with the Vietnamese in Laos in any way?
Some time ago, we had a problem with an excursion that delayed our ability to work with the Lao for almost a year, but in recent times, they have not directly interfered with negotiations. I must say that the Savannah Ket excavation, which was just completed in Laos, demonstrated that the crash site on the surface had been severely picked over by scavengers of one sort or another.
Okay. General Perutz, how many live sighting reports do we have from individuals who took polygraph tests that indicated they were telling the truth, or at least who passed the polygraph test? How many?
16? I think 16, sir. We'll give you the exact number.
A grand total of 16?
Yes.
And what was the most recent?
I want to say 1982. We'll check that for the record. 1982.
Now, what have we done with respect to those 16 reports?
I want to make it clear that polygraphs are only one. We follow up with whatever possible, whether it's technical or whether it's additional human, right. And well, in those cases we have done that. Of the 16, 5 of them, I'll get the figures for you, Mr. Chairman, but 5 of them, as I recall, have been accounted for. 2, we didn't have enough information to follow up, but they're open. 6 of them are outstanding. Is that? 14, in answering your question and correcting the record, it was 16, but 14 no deception, 2 inconclusive, whatever that means. Right. That's the administrator of the polygraph right. Said inconclusive. Of those, 6 have been accounted for, 2 have been determined to be untrue, fabrication, 2 were non-POW, and 4 are open and being followed up.
And now, what would you consider to be the single most persuasive evidence you've received which would indicate that some Americans may be being held against their will in Indochina? If you were asked to say, of all of the reports you've received, live sightings, any other forms of intelligence, is there one that is more persuasive than the others, even if it isn't in and of itself absolutely definitive proof that Americans are being held or an American against their will?
Mr. Chairman, I wish I could give you a single case where I have some very strong feeling that there is substantial evidence. I have an intuitive feeling, like the rest of my colleagues, that based on the numbers and based on the circumstances, there possibly and probably are some Americans over there, most probably roaming freely, some perhaps held captive. If additional interrogation of Mr. Garwood provides confirmatory information which substantiates one of the live sightings of 1982. And again, I'm not one of the analysts who look into every one of these, but from what I've seen, that probably would be the closest thing to an encouraging incident.
So you have no live sightings that have since 1982?
No, sir, we do not.
At all? I'm not talking now about live sightings confirmed by polygraphs. In other words, you have not received a single report since 1982 from
Yes.
someone who claims to have personally seen?
Oh, yes, we've received some just recently, but they relate to incidents of 1982 or before in terms of time.
So you haven't received any live sighting reports of people who claim they saw individuals after 1982?
I might be able to clarify that. I've done a re-scrub on that in preparation for the hearing. We have from, this is by year of sighting, outstanding, that is unresolved first-hand live sightings. 3 in 1981, 2 in 82, 1 in 83, and 2 in 84, 0 in 85, sir.
How many in 85?
0.
0. And how many in 84?
2, sir.
So you had 2 reports from people who claim they saw POWs in 84.
In that year.
Right.
They're unresolved.
And were these people polygraphed?
I have to defer to.
That's 1 in 84. We just received those reports.
One of the reports seems to be missing in action now. Went from 2 to 1.
Have they been polygraphed? They have not been polygraphed, no, sir.
Is there any reason why they haven't?
Any reason why they haven't? We just got those within the last 30 days. Still under investigation. They're still under investigation to see whether it's
in other words, you didn't
appropriate.
receive the report in 84. You received the report recently, and
That's
it
right.
relates to
Yes,
an
sir.
incident which took
Last 30
place in
days.
1984.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
No, no.
now, you've had an opportunity to interview Garwood.
One time, Mr.
Okay.
Samara.
And you presumably saw you were familiar with his briefing to us?
Yes, I have.
Right. Okay. On the basis of your preliminary interview with Garwood, you believe he had a number of very specific allegations. What's your evaluation of that?
Evaluation is it has some possibilities that we have to follow up with subsequent interrogations with Mr. Garwood.
Is he cooperating fully?
He is cooperating qualitatively. He's made some requests for a very controlled environment, but he is cooperating, and we're very, very optimistic that we can press and get a determination.
Are you planning to
Absolutely.
give him a polygraph test?
If it's needed, we will.
Well, why wouldn't you? You were routine.
He has to agree to it.
Have
Mr.
you
Chairman.
asked him to agree?
We have not. We will.
You will?
Yes.
And if he were to refuse to take a polygraph test, what implications would that have for the credibility
We
of
would
his
still
testimony?
follow up on his report, Mr. Chairman.
But that wasn't my question. Would it have implications for his credibility?
It would be one factor, yes.
I mean, I assume you would be prepared to assure him that there'd be he's not telling you this under oath. In other words, if he told you something and the polygraph indicated he was not telling the truth, that wouldn't subject him to any criminal proceedings.
Yes. Well, he talks to us in the presence of his attorney, and that's all taken care of.
We would like to have, as soon as you're in a position to provide it, a complete briefing on your debriefing of Mr. Garwood.
Yes, sir.
Particularly with respect to the allegations.
We'll provide that immediately on the first interview.
I have a whole bunch of additional questions myself for each of you, which I'd like to submit for the record, which hopefully you'll apply to, as well as some questions that have been submitted by Mr. Bacher. Now yield to Mr. Leach.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to say that I have an intuitive feeling that 3 very serious, high-minded Americans are working on this issue, and we appreciate the attention you're giving to it. I also would like to stress that, again, from the minority's perspective, the administration has committed substantial resources and dedication to this issue, and I think that this committee of Congress ought to appreciate that fact.
Well, I certainly subscribe entirely to those sentiments. Gentlemen, what's your absolute deadline for leaving?
It starts at 4:15, sir.
Okay. Keeping that in mind, we'll move down the committee. Mr. Gilman.
Thank you. General Perutz, I'm pleased to hear about the additional staffing you have now. Do you feel that there's any budgetary needs that you might have that our committee can help you address in your work, or any personnel or equipment that you might need?
Thank you, Mr. Gilman. We, as a matter of fact, I neglected to read that we have no constraints. At this point, our people have a blank check to pursue any avenue whether it's bringing people in or whether we have to go out to pursue any lead. But if we need it, we'll let you know.
You were very instrumental in freeing us from those constraints, Congressman Gilman.
I'm pleased to hear that, and I'm pleased that you would now have all the resources
Yes.
you need. General, who are you now reporting to on your progress? What's the chain of command on your report on progress?
My chain of command goes through various levels, right to the Vice President.
Directly to the Vice President?
Through people in his office, yes, sir. But I talk to the Vice President, yes.
And keep him informed of your progress?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there had been 2 Inspector General reviews.
Yes, sir.
Were they of recent date?
Within the last 18 months, I can give you the exact dates, Mr. Gilman.
Could you submit those to our committee?
Sure, yes, we will.
And they were all favorable reports?
Yes, they were.
And you say you now have another review going on?
I have my own review calculated to look at a whole series of areas that I think needs looked into. The database problem that the Congressman talked about, re-looking at some of the more contentious cases to see if there's anything else we could do in terms of some additional national collection efforts. It's just another look at the way we're doing business down there.
Well, how many hardcore cases are there now before you that are being pursued, that you feel are hard evidence of possible live Americans? Just an approximate number.
47.
And of these 47, they're still all under investigation, is that
Yes,
correct?
sir. Yes, they are.
And what is the latest citing of those 47?
Well, I'm told on the basis of the last series we got in 1984, one case.
With regard to Mr. Garwood, is he presently under debriefing and review by your agency?
We've debriefed him once, Mr. Gilman, and
how recent?
Last week, or 26th of February.
And he's cooperating?
He's cooperated.
What about Smith and McIntyre? Are they coming in before you?
No, sir. We have no, at this point, no plans to bring. We are in touch through an intermediary with Mr. Smith in attempting to find a film.
They said they had some material evidence. Have they made it available to you, General?
Not yet, sir, no.
Have you requested it?
Of course.
Mr. Armitage, when you were there in February, was there any additional high-level meeting that you had? You've been meeting with the foreign minister. Had you gone beyond that at all?
No, it was January, Congressman, and I did not. Just with the foreign minister.
Do we have any prospective, I'll conclude in just a moment, Mr. Chairman, any prospective meeting with any higher-level people in the Vietnamese government at this time?
We do not, Congressman.
Thank you.
Yeah, forgive me, Ben, but time is running out, and I know some of the other members have questions. Mr. Solomon.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I know where the gentlemen have to go, and I know it's terribly important, and I'm not going to ask any questions because I'll have plenty of time to ask them in the future as I have in the past. But I just want to say a couple of things real fast. First of all, I want to commend General Perutz and the entire operation. I just am so happy with the way you are going about things. It is tremendously refreshing. You have beefed it up. We know that we're going to have to beef up the ID lab in Honolulu. We know we're going to have to do something with the JCRC as well. But I just want you to know that the actions you're taking with General Tai and with Ross Perot and with others and the way you're moving, it just makes us all feel an awful lot better. And I want to say one more thing about the word cover-up. Because, you know, no member of Congress has ever come to me and ever said one word about there being a cover-up. They don't dare because they'd suffer the consequences. But I just want to know if any member of Congress or anybody else comes to you and brings up this word cover-up. Because you know and I know there is no such thing. When I went through and examined the personnel that's involved in Defense Intelligence Agency and all the other associated agencies, and I found so many prisoners of war, American prisoners of war that are employed there as military people, and other Vietnamese Vietnam veterans, and even back to the Korean War that I was involved in. and you tell me there's some kind of a cover-up, there is no damn cover-up. And I want to know it if anybody utters one word to you, because it's about time that we held those people that might be doing that accountable. So I just want to take off my hat and salute every one of you for a job well done. Keep it up, and one day we're going to get to the bottom of all this.
And if you left at this time, any specific questions to Mr. Monjo, Mr. Armitage will be submitted for the record and can be answered then. So if you'd like to leave, gentlemen, why don't you do so? If your deputies can now come up, and we will continue with the questioning.
Thank you very much.
Okay. You can tell, Paul, he's now free from the long reach of this subcommittee. Free at last, free at last. Thanks, Suharto, he's free at last. Good. Mr. Lagomarsino.
General, I know the answer, and you've already stated it, but I'd like to just get it very clear for the record one more time. Has anybody, first of all, how long have you been on the job now?
A little over 4 months, sir.
4 months. At the time you took the position, or at any time since, has anyone in the government, anyone at all, said anything to you about
Information that you could stay till 4:15. I gather you have to be there at 4:15.
Well, we serve at your pleasure, Mr. Chairman.
Well, do you have deputies here who can fill in for you?
We have a military officer who is the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense for POW, MIA affairs, and a former POW himself who can sit in for me.
Well, let me leave the judgment to you. I know that you wanted to be at the department for this ceremony involving people you've been very closely associated with. We obviously still have questions, but if you have deputies here who are in a position to answer substantive questions, I'm sure the members would understand if you left at this time. Any specific questions to Mr. Monjo, Mr. Armitage will be submitted for the record and can be answered then. So if you'd like to leave, gentlemen, why don't you do so? If your deputies can now come up, and we will continue with the questioning.
Thank you very much.
Okay. You can tell, Paul, he's now free from the long reach of this subcommittee. Free at last, free at last. Thanks, Suharto, he's free at last. Good. Mr. Lagomarsino.
General, I know the answer, and you've already stated it, but I'd like to just get it very clear for the record one more time. Has anybody, first of all, how long have you been on the job now?
A little over 4 months, sir.
4 months. At the time you took the position, or at any time since, has anyone in the government, anyone at all, said anything to you about doing anything other than getting to the bottom of this case?
Oh, no. Oh, not at all. It's a high priority. I came in with no preconceptions. I'm not stigmatized. No, sir. Not.
I imagine what you would tell them if they did anyway.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Yeah, I mean, it's just ludicrous to think that someone with your long and distinguished career and 4 stars on your shoulder would even countenance any kind of a hint of that sort of thing.
Needless to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lagomarsino. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to welcome General Perutz again. We had a very fruitful meeting in Billy Hendon's office a few weeks back, and I too am encouraged that you are on the job and that you're very committed to the resolution of this issue. And I congratulate you on beefing up the staff and seeking to find if there is this mindset to debunk to try to weed that out. I do have a couple of questions, and as you note on page 6 of your testimony, the DIA is actively pursuing the leads of 63 unresolved first-hand cases reporting Americans in captivity. I was wondering if the representatives from State, on behalf of Mr. Monjo, if he could answer whether or not the U.S. has specifically requested permission from the Vietnamese government to visit any of those sites, and if it hasn't to date, are you contemplating that action in the near future?
Excuse me, sir, these are sites of the sightings? Of
yes,
the
live sightings information. I know that they're usually months or years old, but the point being that while sightings have occurred there, certainly it would be good to raise the issue and let them know that we know that this information is on our records. It seems to me that in some of our conversations, we came to the conclusion that that information is yet to be shared with them. And matter of fact, some of the Vietnamese said to us, "Where's the information?" You know, they seemingly were unaware that there were even live sightings, although that begs credibility, I think. But go ahead.
The way we approach that, Congressman Smith, is basically with DOD in preparation in the technical meetings, for the technical meetings that we have with Vietnam. If a case is appropriate, we would give consideration to asking the Vietnamese to follow up and sharing with them, again, if appropriate in this.
No, sir. Okay, can you, Mr. Brecken, again, give us any indications as to why the Vietnamese have established this 2-year time frame within which to resolve this POW-MIA issue?
It's possible to speculate on a number of variety of different reasons. I'm not sure in my own mind which factor might have been most convincing. I think the element of the case that we have made over the years to them, that movement on this is necessary in order that the United States can play its appropriate role when there is a Cambodia solution, without this issue overhanging and making it politically impossible, for instance, to consider resumption of movement toward normalization in the context of an appropriate settlement, a settlement acceptable to the ASEAN countries. That, to my mind, must have been a factor in their calculations. They may have decided that in withholding information they were reaping more ill will than gaining political leverage. That's another possibility. It's hard to put yourself in their shoes and see things through their eyes, so I say this without a whole lot of confidence.
I was wondering how you would compare the attitudes and the performance of the Laotian government, the Vietnamese government, and I understand now even the North Koreans are showing some signs of willingness in the whole area of repatriation of remains. So perhaps you can comment on that, but also the comparison between the two governments, Laos and Vietnam.
We're pleased with the progress that we made in the case of both governments. In the case of Laos, we have had unbroken diplomatic relations in Vientiane with that government, and thus our ability to communicate our concerns and to provide information and to urge that they work with us has been somewhat more continuous, perhaps more direct, and we are very pleased with the success and the progress that's been made up to now. The first excavation of a site in Indochina, for instance, was done in Laos with the agreement of the Lao government in February last year, 1985. The progress in neither country, I think I would say, is satisfactory. We don't consider it yet to be at the pace that we'd like to see. We don't see the results yet that we would like to see, but we're encouraged by each country's approach. Each country has a somewhat different approach because of the kind of relations that we have. On the question of Korea, if I may take that, since that's not my particular area of concern, and get back to you with a written answer, perhaps.
I didn't hear your last comment. I'm sorry.
If, in the case of Korea, I wonder if I could, with your indulgence, get back with a written answer, as I'm not really adequately prepared to deal with that here.
Okay. A couple of more questions, Mr. Chairman. Are there any indications, General Prutz, that from the live sightings, from the 63 unresolved first-hand cases, that some of our servicemen were being mistreated or perhaps being incarcerated in re-education camps?
In most cases, Sir, we don't get that much detail in the information. And I don't know whether there's any specific case of mistreatment on the 63 that we've had. I don't think we've had any details that would give us, and if we had that, we can press to perhaps, the answer is no.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Brecken, what is the position of the department on cross-border forays, and how do you discourage such activities?
Sir, we are opposed to activities by private citizens on a number of grounds. One, certainly that they disrupt the efforts of government-to-government cooperation on this, and they, as somebody earlier mentioned, they can stall activities that are strongly in favor of a solution for some period of time, have in the past done so on the part of one of those governments. We use every means we can to persuade individuals when that's possible, dissuade them from undertaking private forays into these countries based on inadequate information. The results cannot be as effective as government operations can or government activities can based on full information. The activities are dangerous to the people involved, dangerous to the effort, and we discourage them in every possible way.
I do have one final question, Mr. Chairman, and I wonder if, Mr. Brecken, you could just comment on how you feel congressional delegations, as you know there have been two within the last couple of months, our task force and the Senate task force that went over with two members of the House, how those delegations advance the cause of the POW-MIA issue. Do you think it helps, hinders, neutral?
I think, Mr. Smith, over the years, the expression by visiting congressional delegations in Hanoi and in Vientiane of the demand of the American people that more be done on this issue have had a very positive effect in persuading those governments of the necessity to cooperate, of the humanitarian concerns, the popular interest in this issue in the United States, and I think they've been extremely beneficial in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say parenthetically that Joe Snyder from your office accompanied us on our trip and did an outstanding job and was very helpful in providing us with sufficient background during the course of our deliberations, before and after, and I just want to commend him publicly for the great job he did.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Mr. DeWine?
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Are there any other, I think we've exhausted the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Are there any other members present who'd like to ask a question? Mr. Hendon. Yeah. Let me say at 4:30, we are going to recess for 15 minutes and move to room 2200, where we will hear from Ann Mills Griffiths representing the League of Families. But we do have to vacate this room at 4:30. Mr. Hendon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Perutz, we have the greatest respect and admiration for you, sir. We're glad you're over there and appreciate the fine job you're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman.
You said, General, if I wrote it down correctly, that the Garwood debrief substantiates one of the live sightings in '82. Is that the one that you and I and the rest of the crowd talk about a lot?
If I said it substantiated, I said if it did substantiate it, it would be a significant, at this point, we're not sure yet, Congressman Hendon, and we'll pursue that, and it is the one that you're talking about.
And didn't he, without getting into anything classified, you call me if you think I am, didn't he say he saw people at same places, and another witness said he saw something?
We are getting into classified, and
yes.
if
but that other witness passed a couple of polygraphs, and he was one of the 1982 two polygraphs.
We are getting into classified, and I'm not being evasive at all.
Thank you, sir.
Would the gentleman yield at that point?
Yes, sir. I'd be happy to.
Yeah. Just might call attention that it's the intention, I think, of the committee to have a closed meeting with DIA for them to present information on this case. Great. And Bill, that might answer some of your questions.
I'd be pleased to do that.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Smith?
Just a quick question on, given the fact that the two commissions, the Woodcock Commission and the Montgomery Commission, essentially concluded that there were no live Americans held in captivity in Southeast Asia, and the reports that surfaced during the period of time between January and August of 1973, especially after the Paris Peace Accords were signed and sealed and the last prisoners that the Vietnamese released came home in April. The conclusion there was that regarding Laos, who did not participate in the Paris peace talks, they returned no prisoners. There are press releases during the time between April and August referring to prisoners from the Laotians. What evidence do you have that would dispute that would cause a committee to come to the conclusion that both Montgomery and Woodcock came to, that there would be no Americans left alive in Laos, given the fact that none were returned, given the fact that they were referred to in UPI stories, not some Homecoming 2 or Homecoming 1 or anything else you'd like to discredit, but strictly UPI stories. Given the fact that they were referred to in those press releases, what information do we have that would contradict that?
Sir, I think we're going to have to investigate that a little bit further and get back to you on that. Now, in regard to what you said about Americans being returned from Laos, there were 9 that were returned, and we are, as far as bringing up, and they came back through Vietnam, as far as the reports and the Woodstock and the Montgomery Commissions, as you're referring to, and their conclusions, those are not conclusions that we have today, of course. We operate on an entirely different set of assumptions under this administration.
Well, I understand that, but I think the issue here is that we have no evidence, and that's been said a number of times with a number of people, in a number of different hearings for a number of years. We have no evidence that there are Americans alive in Southeast Asia. When you have the other side, who is the enemy, saying they have them, and they don't return them, and we're still bombing them from April of 1973 to August of 1973 by our own admission, how can we conclude that there aren't any there? I'd like to know what evidence you have to have you draw the conclusion that there are no live Americans left in Laos. And that's a conclusion that's been drawn by 2 commissions and testimony before hearing after hearing after hearing, and I want an answer on that question.
Sir, if I could say so, that was not drawn by this administration. It was drawn by 2 congressional commissions prior to this administration, sir. Now, I'd like to point out that the situation is different since the Reagan administration has come to power. And we do not operate on those assumptions that there are no Americans. We operate on the assumption that there are. Given the fact, as you say, we do not have evidence that they are alive, nor do we have evidence that they are dead. But we have a lot of discrepancy cases. We have a lot of unresolved live sighting reports. We have a lot of holes that we're trying to fill. And given this situation, the only responsible stance is to assume that there are Americans alive.
Well, I think that we get into the question of how you define evidence, how you define credible. And I would like to point out for the record that in April, regardless whether it's a congressional commission, I didn't hear anybody from anybody in 1973 come forth to dispute it, or excuse me, in 1976. But what I'm saying is, how do you define evidence? What I'm saying to you is, it's on the record with UPI stories that the Laotians held American prisoners of war. That's what they said. Whether they did, you can dispute that, but they said it. And we were still bombing them from April to August after the Americans supposedly, quote unquote, had all come home. And that's the point I'm making. I'm asking you very specifically, and I would appreciate some response to this question, even if you can't give it now, is what evidence did you have, or what evidence is available in your confidential information, if necessary or whatever, during the contemporary period of April of 1973 to August of 1973, which would dispute that or refute that, saying that there were none?
Sir, we'll get back to you on that, for the record.
Mr. Rowland? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know time is growing short. First, let me thank you for the courtesies you've extended to the ex officio members, those of us that are on the task force but are not on the subcommittee. I just have one question for the General. That's regard to a number of press reports that came out yesterday about a panel or a commission being formed Some reports indicated it was just going to be looking into the DIA. Others appeared to say that this panel or this commission was going to be looking into the whole issue of live Americans and so forth. Would you be kind enough to make a few comments, because I think there's some misinformation?
Yes.
I'd like to know who's going to be on the panel and
Yes.
what the goals are.
The panel is going to be looking into the DIA handling of their records, the manner of evaluations, the resolution of the cases. They'll report to me on their findings, and I'll make those findings available to any appropriate committee of this Congress. The people who are going to be involved, actually there are two groups. There's an analytical group, and these were selected by my friend General Ty, and then there's a senior overview group, because they're not going to get down to the pick and shovels. They're going to take the results of the analysts and see perhaps what else can be done or have not been done, or have some findings. The people involved, and I'll make this a matter of record, General Ty, Colonel McGee, Mr. McCreary, Mr. Maynard, Major General Murray, and Mr. Gloss. That's the analytical group, headed by, and the senior group is Mr. Lyman Kirkpatrick, Lieutenant General John Flynn, ex-PW, General Russell Daugherty, retired, General Bob Kingston, retired, and Mr. Ross Perot, as he's available. And then we'll have a polygraph expert and some other people to support, administrative. And they will go in and take as long as they need, review the records, identify any weak areas, lack of follow-up, make suggestions as to how we can better improve on our analytical efforts and methodology, reporting, dissemination, and provide me a full report of their findings.
So, General, in other words, that examination is going to be of DIA, of the techniques, the procedures.
That's correct.
Versus an oversight of the live sighting information or any other information pertinent to the MIA POW issue.
That's correct, Mr.
Thank you very much,
right.
General.
Mr. Precken? Yeah, you represent the State Department. Is President Reagan in favor or opposed to the establishment of a special commission to investigate this?
The administration attitude, I believe, has been expressed uniformly as believing that a commission is not necessary at this time.
Yeah. Does that reflect the President's view?
It's my understanding, yes.
Yeah, well, I see someone on the White House staff behind you. Maybe you want to consult with him so you can inform us officially.
I'm told that this is an administration position that is supported uniformly by the President Reagan's administration.
And that reflects the views of the President?
I believe so, sir, yes.
But yes or no? I can't.
Yes.
Yes. Try to speak up a little bit. You won't be fired if you make a mistake. Okay. And, yeah, Mr. Solomon.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I did not have the time before to express my views on Congressman Bill Hendon's proposed bill, which established a private sector commission. But I just want to go on record as being unalterably opposed to that for a number of reasons. The main reason being that the Vietnamese government have been emphatic in saying that they will not cooperate in anything other than government to government. And in my opinion, that is not government to government. Secondly, with the progress that has been made by General Perutz, and with my conversations with the administration at several levels, I believe that they're doing what I wanted to do in the first place, and that was to give the President the right, if he doesn't already have that right, to establish a presidential agency within the White House to do exactly what General Perutz is doing now. As a matter of fact, even recommending that Ross Perot be the head of it, but not, as my good friend Mr. Dimely said, tombstoning the name in there. And I still am inclined to go that route, and perhaps we might want to discuss that later on in our subcommittee. But
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be glad to yield.
I'd be tickled to death to support that, Mr. Chairman of the task force. And seriously, I want to work with you and the chairman and everybody else, the president, who is, as you've heard me say many times, the best friend the POW's ever had, to get this thing resolved. So I certainly but want to work in any way possible.
I think we're all agreed that we want this issue resolved in the most effective
Absolutely.
and expeditious fashion possible. And I would hope that in subsequent discussions, I'm sure we'll all be having a way can be found to deal with this, which is compatible with everybody's concerns. Solomon? Yes.
Yeah. I just want to conclude. The reason that I was so concerned about the cover-up, so-called cover-up issue before is, you know, every time I come to one of our meetings, there is a little handout from some organization or group. And this one, I just want to point out, says at the top of it, U.S. congressmen ignore warnings from Vietnamese communist soldiers and obtain proof that DIA lied. See, that's what got me so irritated. And it goes on because let me cite the lies that appear in this document here. It says in the first paragraph that 7 members of Congress, let me preface this by a statement. When I was in the Marine Corps back during the Korean War, we had an old adage, you know, that anytime anybody had to blow their own horn about being a hero, the chances are they were lying, okay? And this article goes on here to say that 7 members of a U.S. congressional delegation pushed their way through approximately 100 Vietnamese armed soldiers at a military compound in Hanoi to find the truth about 2 important live sighting reports. And then it goes on to the next page, and it says that someone managed to route the delegation down Linamday Street on the way to the airport. Yeah, someone managed to route it. As a matter of fact, I asked Deputy Minister Son if he wouldn't take us there so we could go through and we could examine it. He said, fine, we'll take you there. And that's where he was heading us. But this thing here says that someone managed to route the buses down there. And then it goes on to say, as the delegation neared 23 Linamday Street, someone was able to get Congressman Solomon and Congressman Gilman and their interpreter, who knew nothing of the plans to enter the compound, to go into a shop and have tea. Now, we pulled up at the gate of Linamday Street, and we went in, and sure enough, the commander of the base there sat us down at this dingy old table. As a matter of fact, it was about 50 yards from Congressman John McCain's room and board where he had spent 7 years of his life, right just across the little alleyway there. That was a tea shop that we were having tea at, I suppose. And anyway, it just goes on and on. Well, you know, it's this kind of misinformation that is put out that really just discredits a lot of good people and a lot of good organizations. And really what we ought to be doing is getting to the bottom of this. We all ought to really be working together. And again, General, I'm just going to have to take off my hat to you because you really are moving in the right direction. And God bless you. We're going to get to the end of the bottom of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony and for their cooperation. General, I want to tell you how pleased I am that you've been appointed to this position and how much I'm looking forward to working with you in an effort to finally resolve this unfinished chapter in the history of our involvement in Indochina. The subcommittee will stand in recess until 4:45 when we will resume in room 2200 Rayburn in order to hear from Ms. Griffiths. The hearing is in recess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.